God King, Chapter 5.
God and Goddess. Taharka rose to his feet and covered his emotion by falling into the great house formalities that he had been so carefully taught. He inclined his head ceremoniously, as was due to the priestess of Ammon. Then he replied in the manner prescribed, "The god is indeed hungry." Shepnesset turned to the door and clapped her hands. "It will be a minute," she said. She drew closer, looking him over in wonder. "The god has grown tall," she said at last. "So has the lady." The hands that Shepnu extended to his were warm and eager. They both were suddenly shy, but Shepnu couldn't be repressed for long. Her eyes glinted. "Will the god not give the lady the kiss of greeting?" Taharka felt his face grow hot. "The lady knows that takes place before the people on the morrow. Indeed, the god is surprised to see the lady before then." "Thebes is not Napata. The lady goes where she likes." He believed her. He felt sorry for those who had to keep her in check. "So, the lady does not hate Egypt anymore? What of the poppy smoke?" Shepnu had tired of the game. "I've never breathed it. You think I'm a fool? I pretend, and they don't dare do anything about it. And the high priest of Ammon, he asked me what Ammon required to remove the curse from his vineyards in the delta. I told him he must dress up in his wife's clothes and perform the priestess's harvest dance in front of the people." She smiled wickedly. "And he did it." Taharka's eyes widened. Then he realized that, instead of shuddering in horror, he wanted to laugh. He thought of the pompous high priest and actually did chuckle. A platter of food was brought into the chamber. The servants crept out, heads down. Taharka looked at the contents of the meal in disbelief. "Fish? Fish roe? For me? You know it's forbidden." "I have friends," she said. "They get things for me, and some of the priests turn their backs." Taharka drew himself up. He had dared the gods enough for one day. A ring of authority entered his voice. "The god is not pleased. Take it away." Shepnu shrugged and ordered something else. As he ate, she drew up a stool and talked. There were stories of her pranks and misdeeds, but he noticed that, as with him, the bright spots were only spots. Most of her life was unpleasant routine. In a moment of silence, he looked at her and said, "The god is indeed happy to see his lady. You are missed in Napata." Shepnu smiled, but then her lips grew hard. "I will always be missed in Napata." "What do you mean? We will always—" He stopped, because of course they would not always be together. The custom, the god in Napata, the priestess in Thebes, sacred wife and god husband, but never together. "It was his fault," said Shepnu. "Pianki." "Pianki?" Taharka was puzzled. What did his half-brother Pianki have to do with it? "Pianki the Great, that Pianki, the first of our line, the Great. He was so great because he left his wife here in Thebes to rule as priestess so he could go back to Napata and keep on being the god. She was so great they never changed the custom. It's their fault." Taharka thought about this, about those strong women who, since the days of Pianki, had ruled in Thebes like the old, all-powerful African queens in the stories. He thought about Shepnu and how she was now one of them. Little Shepnu, could she do it? She had always been stubborn, tough, and now she had changed. She was grown up. So was he. Had he changed? Not much, he thought. He still thought of himself as the captive child god, the prisoner in the great house, not as a man or king. "You don't know how to be the god," Shabbataka had said. Well, he had tried. He had failed today before the Holy of Holies. But if Shepnu could do these things, he still could try. He put down his bowl and said, "The customs stand, O lady, but 2 of us are stronger than 1." She nodded. Her movement caused her braids to swing. The little braids reminded Taharka of the ones he had pulled years before. "Do you remember?" he began. And suddenly they went back to being children again, recalling the old days in Napata, the games in the children's court, laughing at old jokes. "Remember Shabataka? Remember the time he put the snake in the sun priest's chalice?" "I never liked Shabataka," said Shepnu. In the middle of one of Shepnu's stories, something about a way she had found to get into the Holy of Holies and how, one of these days, she was going to do it, the God King fell asleep. Shepneset stood looking down at the tall, tired boy. The laughter in her eyes had died away. They were grave and brooding, like the eyes of a mother. She half turned to the door to call for a servant, but changed her mind. She draped his arm over her shoulders and walked him, still sound asleep, to the alcove where he collapsed and rolled over onto the great bed. Before she left, she bent down and kissed him. Chapter 6. Gathering Clouds. No, Taharka decided, a month after his arrival, Thebes was not Napata. The king had, for example, a food taster to guard against poison. In Napata, this would have been unthinkable. What assassin would dare target the god? Taharka couldn't believe the man was in any danger, but he didn't stir up any trouble by getting rid of him. He had kept his word to himself. He was learning how to be the god. He was staying awake at the council meetings, asking questions, watching the faces of the men who were his advisors. The Theban vizier seemed to be honest enough. As for the high priest of Ammon, he could not read his face, until one day he reversed one of his judgments. The commanders of the army were easy to understand. They wanted action. They looked back in longing to the days of Egypt's glory. They looked to the east and the north, where a new shadow loomed, a shadow that had once been Egypt's, the Assyrians. More and more often, the meetings seemed to center around news of the Assyrians. A new king in power, another city threatened. The army commanders were angry. Who were these upstarts to lay claim to the world that had once bowed before Egypt? Egypt was one again. How long before she awoke from her long sleep? From the south came unsettling news, brought by messengers on swift horses, riding right across the desert, the great Cushite bend of the Nile. It was sad news. 3 good friends had died all at once. The priest of Horus, a man most devoted to the young Taharka, who was named for his god, had choked on his food at dinner and could not be revived. The heart of Taharka's old tutor had failed, though it had never troubled him before the hour of his death. And then the vizier of Napata, a most just and honorable man, had ridden out to hunt the hippopotamus and not ridden back again. Taharka was grieved. He had been fond of the vizier. He remembered the patient help of his old tutor and the stories of the hawk god told by the kindly priest of Horus. He would make special offerings at their tombs when he returned to Napata. That evening he was offered a dish of the unspiced goose considered fit for Pharaoh. He refused it. Shepneset had smuggled in more tempting, though still not forbidden, items, and he had already dined. The smuggled food saved his life. The taster had already sampled some of the goose and had noticed nothing unusual, but that night he became very ill. In the morning, he was dead. It could have been spoiled. Taharka could not believe what had happened, though for the first time in his life he was feeling the real, cold clutch of fear. Gently, soothingly, Shepneset stroked his hand. They were together on the rooftop garden, together as often as they could be, while they could be. No, she said. He would surely have tasted that. Taharka rose suddenly. It was all becoming too much. Who was behind this horror? Who had dared? Had they been paid? At the meetings there had been talk of murders paid for by the agents of the Assyrians. No, it was all too much. I can't do it, he said suddenly. It was all a mistake. How can I stand up to them all, make the decisions, now not even knowing who to trust, and without you? He stopped, for that was the way things were. The marriage, the ritual, the union of the god with the divine priestess, then back to Napata, alone. We're not supposed to love each other, said Shepneset soberly. But we do, he said bitterly, and he knew it was true. It had always been true. Yes, we have that. That's something, isn't it? No, people live with their wives. Everybody has someone to work with, make plans with, to be with, on his side. Everybody but us. Shepneset, did you ever think of just running away? Almost to his surprise, Shepneset said, Yes. We could do it. Nobody knows our faces. I could work on the docks. My grandfather built boats. You are not your grandfather, said Shepneset quietly. You are the god king. In Napata, the grizzled soldier Mbuta knelt before the image of the serpent god. It was his favorite. It reminded him of the carved wooden image in the far-off, long-ago jungles of his childhood. For some reason, those far-away forests had been much in his mind that day. The village, its narrow lanes teeming with goats and fowl, his father, the boat builder, the joyous trips down the Zambezi to the market town on the eastern sea, the cargoes of oil and fish and palm wine, his little sister with her big, curious eyes and her love of stories. The happy days of yesteryear. The days now were not happy. The stories of the Assyrians, the whispering of the men who now surrounded the god's companion, always silenced when he appeared, the arrogance of the companion himself. Should he warn his nephew? Of what should he caution him? In the shadows, a dark figure hovered, a dagger gleaming in its hand. And that is the end of chapter 7. Before you finish your time here today, I'd like you to look up the Zambezi River, and I'd like you to compare its location to the other places that we've read about in the book. You could look at Thebes and Napata and find them on the map and then compare those to the Zambezi. So you'll see where Mbuta was from and, just compare those locations. It'll be interesting, and we will talk about that in class next week.